Good evening to all our wonderful listeners. Thank you so much for joining us again this evening. And this evening, we have a very special topic we need to talk about. We're going to be talking about diabetes. Don't you turn us off. Tune right in. Come close, lean in, and let's have a heart-to-heart talk about diabetes. So, as you know, diabetes is a health issue. And if you're paying attention to the news and paying attention to various commercials, diabetes is a major issue in our society. And as a nurse practitioner, this is one of the conditions I spend a lot of time talking to patients about. I believe that if we band together, we can reduce this epidemic of diabetes in the United States and in the world. So just for some statistics on diabetes, there is a total of 34.2 million people who have diabetes in the United States of America. So I think our population is just over 300 million, and 10% of the US population has diabetes. Diagnosed is 27 million people, including 26.8 million adults. Undiagnosed, they believe that there are 7.3 million people, or 21.4% of people who have diabetes in the United States that are undiagnosed. And what that means is that there are many people in the nation with what we call pre-diabetes, or risk factors that lead to diabetes, and probably they never get tested, and so they don't realize that they have a diagnosis of diabetes. So in terms of pre-diabetes, so now remember I said 34 million people have diabetes, 88 million people age 18 or older have pre-diabetes.
That's crazy.
That's 35%
Wow.
of the United States population. For people 65 years or older, or senior group, 24.2 million people have pre-diabetes. So what does that tell us? It tells us that we need to be vigilant, we need to pay attention, we need to be having conversations with our primary care physicians or providers about diabetes. Hear me well, listeners. If you know anyone in your family who has diabetes, then you also know that you are at risk for diabetes. Let's talk for a little bit about who should be getting tested for diabetes. So if you have a first-degree relative with diabetes, you should be monitored for diabetes. If you're in a high-risk race or ethnicity group, such as African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, Asian Americans, or Pacific Islanders, you should be getting tested for diabetes. You need to be monitored. Somebody needs to take an extra look. Let me just put in a pause there to say, if you have a primary care provider that you are not comfortable with and doesn't listen to you when you say, I want to be tested for something, find somebody else who is going to listen to you, okay? Testing should also be considered in adults who are overweight or obese, meaning they have a BMI greater than 25. And in Asian Americans, we say greater than 23 because they have a smaller bone density. So if you are over 25 BMI, or you're Asian American with a BMI of 23 or above, and you have any more of these other risk factors that I'm reading out to you, you should be monitored, considered for monitoring for diabetes mellitus. So first,
what age should we start to
we're
monitor?
going to talk about that.
Okay.
So first degree relative with diabetes, high risk race or ethnicity group, if you have a history of cardiovascular disease, if there's any hypertension, if there's any high cholesterol, you should be tested for diabetes. For women who have polycystic ovarian syndrome, you should be monitored for diabetes. If you're a sedentary person, not physically active, we know that Laura bikes and hikes, but if you're not doing any walking or biking or hiking or swimming and you're very sedentary, you should be tested for diabetes. Other clinical conditions associated with insulin resistance, such as severe obesity, you should be checked. Patients with prediabetes, that is an A1C that is greater than 5.7, should be tested yearly. And women who are diagnosed with gestational diabetes mellitus should have lifelong testing every 3 years. The Diabetes Association recommends, but I will tell you from practice that if you have had gestational diabetes, you should have a test at least once a year. For all other patients, testing should begin at age 45. So having said that, Laura, it's sad to say that most of us need to get tested before 45.
Yeah.
We have children who are obese. So if they have obesity, they have to start testing earlier. So it's only if you have none of these things that you can wait till 45 to start testing.
Right.
Hypertension is a massive issue in our society. I will tell you that many of the patients I take care of are obese, diabetic, hypertension, high cholesterol.
Wow.
And then if they smoke on top of it, that's a fifth issue that we have to consider when we're talking about diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Any other questions before I move on?
Well, what about, for example, we have none of those, but you mentioned that
was my question.
You know,
Thank you.
we fall into the ethnicities that are, potential risk. So if we don't have any of those medical conditions, but we fall within the ethnicities you called out, 45 years old is good?
No, earlier.
All right.
Earlier.
So then when should that,
Right.
when do you think it should be?
Oh, no, we start from you're an adult.
Okay.
Unless you're an obese child.
Okay.
Okay, so if you're an African American, you need to start from in your 20s. I will tell you straight up that in my practice, in our practice that I work with my medical doctor and director, every single adult patient is screened for diabetes.
Okay.
And if the population is African American, Latino, if the person is obese, we are making sure we're screening for diabetes. The earlier you catch diabetes, the earlier we diagnose diabetes, the more we can put into preventing or controlling that condition. So this is very, very important.
I think that's interesting that you say the earlier we catch it, right, when you're pre-diabetic.
That's correct.
You have the opportunity to maybe reverse the effects and
That's
not
correct.
become diabetic.
That's correct. You can reverse the intensity of the diabetes, and for sure, you can control, prevent, and reverse cardiovascular disease, because the problem with diabetes and hypertension and hypercholesterol, hyperlipidemia, is the risk you run for cardiovascular disease, which is the number one killer in the entire world and in the United States, including the United States of America.
So how many type of diabetes do you have? Type 1, type 2?
So technically, we have a lot more than that.
Okay.
But that's typically what you'll hear people talk about, type 1 and type 2. And in the past, there was a delineation that type 1 is if you have it as a child, and type 2 is if you have it as an adult. Well, the American Diabetes Association has made it very clear to us that over the years, there's now a mingling. You can have diabetes type 1 or type 2 as a child, and you can have diabetes type 1, type 2 as an adult. So another definition that we use is if you have to have insulin because there's autoimmune destruction of the pancreas, you're definitely going to be type 1 because we need to put you on insulin. Your body is not making any insulin at all. Okay? With type 2, typically there is a reduced production of the insulin that is needed to convert the glucose, convert the nutrients and get that glucose, break it down so we can get it into the muscle. Okay? And on that note, I want to tell our audience and us that diabetes is not just a pancreatic condition. The pancreas is involved, the liver is involved, fat cells are involved, the kidneys are involved, the intestines are involved, the brain is involved. Okay, the alpha cells of the pancreas is involved. Usually we talk about the beta cells of the pancreas, but the glucagon forming, this is a little bit of pathophysiology if you're interested. There's so many organs that are involved, and now we have a conglomerate of medications that are used to affect different parts of the body so that we can control diabetes. And I don't want you to feel guilty if you're a diabetic and you eat, you have cravings, because part of diabetes is that the brain, the biofeedback is messed up and the brain is not getting satisfied. And so you don't have satiety. So you keep eating and eating and eating, and you, the onlooker, will create a judgment that, why doesn't that person stop eating? They have diabetes. The brain is not getting the message that it has enough sugar, so it's not telling you to stop eating. So you have cravings.
Wow, that's really interesting.
It's very interesting, and the more you study, diabetes is so wide and so deep and so complex. We could talk about it for weeks and still not meet.
And I think there's
all
a lot
the
of
facts.
stereotyping that goes on. Sometimes we see people, and because they're of a particular weight, we assume that they are diabetic.
Yes.
And that is not the case. They're
Yes.
healthier than you
Yes.
or myself. Yes. And at the same time, you may see a skinny person, and that person could be full-blown diabetic. So why is there a stigma to diabetes? I don't, it's like such a stigma like mental health. It's like a stigma, like people, nobody wants anyone to know, hey, you have diabetes, because it's like a curse word, like that's something bad, you know? So from a medical standpoint, why do you think there's a stigma out there to diabetes?
Because people are afraid. When people have diabetes, they think, oh my kidneys are gonna get affected and I'm gonna end up on dialysis. No. So there are several things with diabetes. You know, people think if people are fat, they're diabetic. Like you said, it's not true. We have fat people who are not diabetic, and we have skinny people who are diabetic. I say in the practice that if you're skinny and diabetic, you're really a diabetic. If you're fat and diabetic, let's lose the weight and see if you're really diabetic. So like I mentioned, fat cells, those fat cells, that fatty tissue is an organ of insulin resistance. So what happens in diabetes is that your body and its natural functioning, there is a breakdown, there's a lack of communication. I'm trying to put it in layman's terms, where the body cannot use insulin, or there's not enough insulin being secreted. And so we call it insulin resistance, where the body cannot move that sugar into the muscle so that you can have the energy to do what you need to do. And one of the organs that does not store sugar is the brain. So if the brain is not getting glucose, it's going to keep you eating. It's going to keep telling the liver, make more sugar, because the liver is responsible for making new sugar. If there's not enough sugar, glucose, to get into the cells. If the muscle is not getting the glucose to make energy, to have energy to do its work, the body keeps trying to protect it by making more sugar. The more sugar you have floating in the blood, the more problems we're going to have as diabetic.
All right, so let me try and figure this out in layman's terms. because I find it fascinating what you're saying about the fat cells. So basically, if we think about fat cells, those fat cells are almost creating a barrier for allowing the glucose to enter the muscle.
Right.
So you got your muscle, you got your fat cells, and then it's like trying to penetrate and it can't.
Right.
So then
that's insulin resistance.
Insulin resistance. And so I find that also interesting because when you talk to some folks that are a bit overweight, they're saying, well, I don't have the energy to go out and exercise. And it is because the energy that you need from the muscle, you've got a barrier and it's not allowing you to get there.
Right.
All right, now I got it.
Exactly. So
I have a question. My understanding is, especially with kids, because I know one of my son's friend, when he was little, thankfully his grandma was a nurse, and he kept going to the bathroom consistently for urinating, and he was almost in a diabetic coma. And if she was not a nurse, that would have probably happened. So what are the signs besides that? What are the signs, especially for kids, that you could decipher that maybe there's a problem and that person, that child could be diabetic?
So the danger for children is that fat. They're peeing a lot, they're very thirsty, and they can go into what we call diabetic ketoacidosis very quickly. And so that is an emergency situation where we need to have people who are vigilant. Again, parents who are taking their children to the pediatrician. The pediatrician is monitoring. One of the things your doctor should do is ask you about family history. So if, my dad was diabetic. I have brothers and sisters who are diabetic. My sister has passed. But it means for my entire life, I know that I am at risk for diabetes. And to keep it real, recently, in the last few years, my son is 16, so maybe in the last 5 or so years, I officially was diagnosed as diabetic, okay? So if you know your family history, you know that this thing is running after you, and you need to figure out, how do I keep it from enveloping me? Can we have a relationship? How can I control diabetes and not let diabetes control me? So as you go to the pediatrician, as you go to the primary care, and the history is asked, if they're asking about your family, there's a reason. We ask about family to see what are the conditions that families have, so that we can work with each patient to prevent or to detect early any conditions that may be there that we can work with. America is known for prevention. If you come from the islands, we have a concept of, if it isn't broken, don't touch it. But in America, we look before it's seen. We look before you feel it. So many people with high blood pressure will say to me, I don't feel bad. No, you don't feel bad because it's called the silent killer. So you won't feel that you have high blood pressure until you have a fight or you blow up and you have a stroke. We get to the hospital and the nurse is going to ask you, as I've asked many patients when I was in the ICU, what, did your mom have high blood pressure? Did your father have No, they never. But he got angry and he had a stroke. I said, that's because he had high blood pressure. Was he even going to the doctor to figure out that he had high blood pressure? So we really need to have these good relationships with healthcare providers who will help us to prevent. We can detect things earlier and we can treat earlier.
And that's why it is very important to do our annuals.
Exactly.
And it was one of those times that I had my annual, probably almost a decade ago, that I myself was told that I'm pre-diabetic. And then from there, I ended up being diabetic. And I'm kind of smiling because I remember it was like a shock because I was little. I mean, I was tiny.
Small,
yeah.
Exactly.
So when my doctor mentioned that I'm pre-diabetic, I'm like, how you mean I'm pre-diabetic? I know someone who is 350 pounds and she is not pre-diabetic. And he said, is your mom diabetic? So I said, yeah, my mom was diabetic. And I have 2 sisters that are diabetic. So he said, mine is hereditary.
You have genetic predisposition
Vision. Right.
to diabetes. If you have a first degree relative with diabetes, your risk goes higher.
Right. So, so I said to so that was kind of a shock, and I'm there thinking because, like I just said, just to let you guys know, I love sugar. I love ice cream and all of those kind of stuff. So I'm like, oh my gosh. So I'm gonna have to change my entire diet, and that's a hard pill to swallow,
Yes.
basically. So I remember about 2 or 3 months ago, a close friend of mine called me and she said, "Oh my God, Venoria, I went to the doctor and he told me I'm diabetic. I'm depressed. I'm this, I'm that." I'm like, "You're not gonna die. You're acting like you're gonna die." And she took it so it was like she felt like her world was crashing down on her. So, and I think that's because there's a stigma out there if you get diagnosed with some type of disease that you're gonna instantly die.
Right.
And it's not, everything is treatable. You just have to do what it is you're supposed to do and pay attention to whatever your doctor advises you to do. So
Exactly. I have a question because you mentioned this word, ketoacidosis. And then I think of all these people that are on a keto diet. So are we talking the same thing? And what does the keto diet have to do with insulin or absorption or any of the things that we're talking about?
So let me just say they're not related.
Okay.
So if you're on the keto diet, remind me, Laura, tell me about the keto diet a little bit. What are you eating? What do people
Proteins.
eat on the keto? Okay.
It's heavy protein, little to no carbs and sugar.
Okay. So on that note, what you're doing in a keto diet is not giving your body sugar and carbs to burn. And you're asking your body to burn the protein.
Yes.
When you burn protein, you go into ketosis, where you put ketones into your urine.
Yes.
That's totally different than ketoacidosis,
Okay.
which is actually, to put it in layman's terms, it's almost like sugar poisoning.
Okay.
So you have these high levels of sugar and it puts you into a coma.
Got it.
And it's very dangerous. You can die if you have a very high sugar. In adults, if you have a high sugar, we have people with very high sugars, 700, 800, and they don't necessarily go into a coma, but we need to get them into the hospital to use an insulin drip or something to bring that number down. Now, if you're going to your primary care, and I'm going to keep saying that because that's how you prevent that from happening. Usually with kids, it could happen, but we're hoping that the pediatrician will catch that before the child gets into trouble, or as in your case with this young child that you shared about, the parent was able to get into it quickly, and save the child from going through that. So
what determines whether or not you need to take insulin versus regular medication?
Okay. So there's a conglomerate of medication on the market now that can deal with diabetes, and many patients are opting to go through all the medications before getting to insulin. I think the stigma is more related to I don't want to stick myself with a needle, and people think that because they have diabetes, it means they're going to have insulin. The only time you really need to have insulin is when your pancreas is totally not functioning and giving you insulin. Then you need to have insulin. There are so many other things we can do before we get there. And that's where it comes to willpower. I want to touch a few other points, and then I'm going to talk about what we need to do as diabetics to reduce the impact of diabetes in our lives. So if you have diabetes and you smoke, you're in trouble, okay? So we want you to quit smoking. If you're overweight or obese, there needs to be behaviors that reduce that BMI, reduce the overweight situation and obesity. And you may ask me, what is being overweight? A BMI of 25 to 30 is considered overweight. Anything above 30 is obese, okay? If you're inactive, we're asking you to become more active. The A1C, I'll leave your primary care to discuss with you. We typically want your A1C to be less than 5.7. 5.7 to 6.4 is considered pre-diabetic. Anything over 6.5, 6.4 is diabetic.
So that leads me to a question. So you can be diabetic and then become undiabetic.
You can become pre-diabetic.
Okay, so you can't, in other words, you can't go back and never be diabetic, period.
You're always at risk. You're always at risk. You could work hard. So a skinny person with diabetes is always going to have a challenge. An obese person with diabetes can lose the weight, control their blood pressure, control their cholesterol, and we can get them back to numbers that are even pre-diabetic. But some, they're very tenuous. We have to watch them carefully, all right? High blood pressure, high cholesterol, all things that complicate and make diabetes worse. Blood sugar management, which is what I was just talking to you about, can reduce the risk of eye disease, kidney disease, and nerve disease by 40%. That's phenomenal. So if we can control it, and diabetes is not a death sentence, we need to control it, not let it control us. Blood pressure management can reduce the risk of heart disease and stroke by 33 to 50%, and decline in kidney function by 30 to 70%. Cholesterol management can reduce cardiovascular complications by 20 to 50%. Regular eye exams and timely treatment could prevent up to 90% of diabetes-related blindness. And regular foot exams and patient education could prevent up to 85% of diabetes-related amputations.
So I have a question. With all of that, when we're talking about regulating, is this all medicinal regulation,
No.
or can you regulate with diet?
So the first way to treat diabetes, in the algorithm that we work from to treat diabetes, the first thing is lifestyle change.
Okay.
What does that mean? If you are sedentary, we want you to get up. We want you to dance. We want you to walk. We want you to run. We want you to swim. We want you to play tennis. We want you to play cricket, soccer, football, whatever activity that gets the body burning. Exercise improves insulin resistance. So the more you exercise, the more the body will be conditioned to use insulin properly and to get the glucose through the locked door into the muscles. So the first thing we beg everybody to do is move. Just keep it moving. What's that cartoon? I'd like to move it, okay?
There you go.
So we need to move it. We need to put the music on and dance. Dancing is a very good activity. That's not boring. People tell you they don't like to walk. They're afraid to walk. Do something in the house. I tell my patients, if it's raining, walk up and down in the house. You'd be amazed if you check your blood sugar and it's high and you just do walking in the house for like 15 minutes and check it again, the blood sugar goes down, okay? Also, diet. So I'm not a sugar craver. I don't have to have sugar. People who have sugar cravings, it poses a problem. So the first thing I tell all my patients to do, and I think they despise me for it, is get rid of sugar in all form in the house. I tell them, do not buy ice cream, do not buy cookies. I love when they tell me, can't I have sugar-free cookies? I say, it's not a cookie if it's sugar-free. Can I have sugar-free candy? It's not candy if it's sugar-free. I said, they just didn't load it up with added sugar. It has its own sugar. What makes candy? What makes cakes and ice cream and cookies? I say oatmeal cookies are so delicious. You know why? They're full of sugar and butter. So I tell them, let's change our lifestyle. So one of the things we talk about in diabetes is that we don't just go in and try to change people's lives. We sit with the patient and it needs to be a mutual conversation. So let's talk about your lifestyle. What are the things you love? And that's how I talk to my patients, and I say, what are the things you like to eat? What are the things you absolutely have to have? What can you do without? What can you change? And we work out the plan together. I strongly advise our listeners that if you are diabetic, if you know family members with diabetes, you do that. Don't just take everything away because they're going to go crazy and eat it all. Okay, but maybe everything in moderation. So one thing is sure, we always talk about moderation, but when you're diabetic, moderation becomes an even more important word.
Well, one of the things, and when we do coaching in my practice, and I'm not a medical practice, executive coaching, is we talk about habits and creating new habits, right? Because we're talking about behaviors. And so in listening to you, one of the habits that we can create is say, okay, don't throw away all the cookies because you have to bring it down in moderation. But in order to have that one cookie, then go out and walk around the block. And you're not allowed to have that cookie or that half cookie until you do any form of exercising, whether it's move it or something else. And so we call that habit stacking, right? So you initiate your first habit, which that first habit is any form of movement. You decide which one, and not a reward, because we don't want to associate the habit with reward. We basically want to say we're establishing a new habit to get rid of an old habit, cookie eating. So you start off and you do your movement, 1 cookie. You start off and you do your next movement, 3/4 of a cookie. Next movement, and so on, until the habit, you've trained the brain that really what it wants is that new habit of whatever movement you've chosen and not the cookie.
Exactly. And the more you move, the more the brain will get the signal that it's satiated and you will eat less. I also believe that there is the need for psychological support.
Absolutely.
So a patient may need to have psychotropic drugs to help them not crave, to cut back on that signal from the brain that makes them crave to eat certain things. And to our listeners out there, I speak the speak and I walk what I speak because I am diabetic. And for years, I would not say I'm diabetic. I am one of the high-risk people who has polycystic ovarian syndrome. So I've always known that diabetes was waiting for me as I get older. The older you get, the more at risk you are for diabetes. We have a population that's obese. We have a population that's aging. So we're going to see more and more diabetes. And my goal is to do my part to reduce the impact of diabetes on the cardiovascular system. So to close off this session, I just want to share with you that you can go to the American Diabetes Association and you will find a little quiz there that talks about your diabetes risk test. You can look there and you'll find it if you type in diabetes.org/risk test, and you can take a test that will tell you if you're at risk for diabetes type 2. How old are you? If you're less than 40, it's 0 points. 40 to 49, 1 point. 50 to 59, 2 points. 60 years or older, that's 3 points. So your age determines your risk for diabetes. Are you male or female? Guess what? Women get 0 points, men get 1 point. That's interesting because women have pregnancies and have gestational diabetes. If you are a woman, have you ever been diagnosed with gestational diabetes? If your answer is yes, it's 1 point. No, 0. Do you have a first-degree relative, mother, father, sister, or brother with diabetes? If you answer yes, it's 1 point. No, 0. Have you ever been diagnosed with high blood pressure? If your answer is yes, it's 1 point. Are you physically active? If you say no, it's 1 point. And then you see to the right on that quiz, it says, what is your weight category? It gives you your height. It tells you 3 different levels of weight. And depending on where you fit in that weight, you can score 1, 2, or 3 points. If you scored 5 or higher, you are at increased risk for having type 2 diabetes. So I did the test. I scored 6. I'm glad I'm not 8 or 9. But I'm at 6, and I can make changes based on this. I can become more physically active so that I can get rid of that point. So I hope we have shared a lot of good information with you. Diabetes is a very big topic. We could talk about it for all evening and more evenings and more sessions. But I hope I've tweaked your appetite to know that you have control. Diabetes does not need to control you. You can control diabetes. Please love on your family members, your mom, your dad, your sisters, your brothers, yourself, your cousins, your uncles, your aunts, and work together as a family to change the pattern of diabetes in our culture. We love so much to talk about health with you so that you can take care of yourself. Until next time, we are Global Women Enrichment signing out for this week. Thank you for joining us.